When she first heard the news that her childhood home had been sold, it felt as though the ground beneath her feet had cracked open and she was free falling into an emptiness she couldn't describe, because that house was not just walls and a roof, it was the keeper of her earliest memories, the silent witness to every laugh, every tear, every innocent dream she once had, and in a single decision made without her consent, all of that had been stripped from her as though her past had been put up for sale and handed over to strangers, leaving her with nothing but the echo of what used to be. She could still remember the front door that creaked every time she pushed it open after school, the worn-out steps that carried the marks of her tiny feet as she grew older, the kitchen that always smelled of her mother's cooking even when the pots were cold, and the small window in her bedroom through which she used to watch the stars at night while whispering secrets to herself, believing the universe was listening. And now all of those sacred places that shaped her into who she was had been erased with a single transaction, signed away as if they carried no weight, as if her attachment to them meant nothing, and what hurt her most wasn't the loss of the house itself, but the way it was done, without her voice, without her feelings even considered, as though she was a guest in her own story, as though her parents forgot that while to them it might just have been a property, to her it was the foundation of her identity, the one place that anchored her whenever the world outside felt too heavy. She thought about the tree in the backyard, the one she used to climb as a child when she wanted to escape from everyone, a place where she imagined herself as a queen ruling over her own kingdom, the carvings of her initials still etched into the bark along with childish doodles, all of them now belonging to strangers who would never understand the meaning behind them, strangers who might chop it down without a second thought, and the thought tore at her insides, leaving her restless, questioning why her parents would make such a choice, why they would take away something so personal and so irreplaceable, and she couldn't help but feel invisible in the process, like her emotions had no value, like the years she spent creating memories within those walls were disposable, and it wasn't just about bricks and furniture, it was about trust, it was about respect, it was about being part of the family's decisions instead of being blindsided by them, and the betrayal burned deeper because it came from the very people who were supposed to protect her, who were supposed to understand that the home was her safe haven, the place she retreated to whenever she felt the world was too cruel, and now that sanctuary had been snatched away, leaving her wandering with no roots, no sense of belonging, and she replayed the day she found out over and over again in her head, remembering the calm way her parents mentioned it, as if it were just a matter of necessity, as if there was nothing extraordinary about erasing a lifetime of her memories with the stroke of a pen, and she had sat there, frozen, unable to speak, her heart pounding in her chest while her mind screamed that this wasn't fair, that something so sacred should not be treated so casually, and even when she tried to explain her pain, it felt as if her words bounced off a wall, unheard and unacknowledged, leaving her in silence, drowning in grief for a place that no longer belonged to her, a place that had once been her entire world, and as she stood one last time in the hallway, running her fingers over the walls that had heard her cries, her laughter, her whispered dreams, she felt a deep sense of loss that words could never carry, a silent goodbye to the life she once knew, and thou. Without your voice, it isn't just the loss of a building, it's the theft of everything you believed was yours forever, it's the shattering of a bond you thought could never be broken, and as she walked away for the last time, every step felt heavier, every breath felt like an effort, because she wasn't just leaving behind a house, she was leaving behind the only proof that she had once belonged somewhere in this world. The weight of betrayal pressed down on her chest like an invisible stone, suffocating her from the inside, because it wasn't just anyone who had made her feel discarded, it was her own parents, the two people she had once believed would always protect her from the cruelties of the world, the ones who were supposed to be her safe place, her foundation, yet they had become the very source of her pain, and that realization tore through her like a wound that refused to heal, because betrayal from strangers hurts, but betrayal from family cuts deeper than any blade, it digs into the parts of you that are most vulnerable, the parts you thought were safe, and she couldn't stop asking herself how the people who raised her, who held her when she cried, who promised to love her unconditionally, could so easily disregard her feelings, how they could make decisions that erased her past and then carry on as though nothing had changed, as though her broken heart was not worth noticing, and in the quiet moments of the night, when the world was still and she was left alone with her thoughts, the pain echoed louder, every memory of their words and actions replaying in her mind, each one twisting like a knife, making her question everything she thought she knew about love and loyalty, because if the people she trusted most could betray her, then what did trust even mean, what value did it hold, and the questions spiraled endlessly, keeping her awake, tearing her apart from within, and she tried to silence them, tried to convince herself that maybe her parents had no choice. She had never asked before questions about loyalty, about self-worth, about how much one should sacrifice in the name of family, and she realized that betrayal doesn't just break trust, it shatters the image you once held of someone, it forces you to see them not as the guardians of your innocence but as flawed, fallible, and sometimes selfish human beings, and that shift in perspective is its own kind of loss, a loss that lingers far longer than the initial wound, because once innocence is gone, once the illusion of unconditional safety is destroyed, you can never get it back, and she felt that loss with every breath, carrying it like an invisible scar that would follow her wherever she went, a scar that whispered to her in the silence that even love has limits, even family can fail you, and the more she thought about it, the more the pain intertwined with anger, because sadness alone could not carry the weight of such betrayal, anger had to rise to meet it, anger at being dismissed, at being treated like a child with no voice even though she had grown, anger at the realization that her parents' choices had not been made with her in mind, and that anger burned in her chest, refusing to be extinguished, driving her to question not just her parents but herself, wondering if she had been foolish to trust so completely, if she had been naive to believe in unconditional love, and though she tried to silence those thoughts, they returned again and again, louder each time, making her doubt her place in her family, making her wonder if she truly mattered to them at all, because how else could they so easily disregard the house that was filled with her laughter, her tears, her dreams, and how else could they ignore the ache in her voice when she spoke of her pain? And it was in those moments that she realized betrayal wasn't just about what they did, it was about how they made her feel invisible, unheard, and unseen, and that was a kind of wound deeper than any action cowl yourself, to question whether you ever truly belonged, and she carried that question with her in every interaction, every forced smile, every silent meal shared across the table, wondering if they could see the cracks in her heart, wondering if they even cared, and though she tried to keep her composure, tried to pretend that everything was fine, inside she was unraveling, her faith in the bond she once thought unbreakable slipping away with each passing day, leaving her standing at a crossroads where love and pain, trust and betrayal, family and self-worth all collided in a storm she could no longer control. Every corner of the house had been soaked in her memories, every wall carried whispers of her childhood, and every room told a story only she could understand, so when the house was gone it felt as though an entire chapter of her life had been ripped out and set on fire, leaving nothing but ashes in her hands, because memories are not just moments frozen in time, they are alive within the spaces where they were created, and she could still see herself running down the hallway with untied shoelaces, laughing breathlessly as her hair flew behind her, she could still hear the echo of her own footsteps chasing her sister, she could still picture the dining table where they gathered for meals, a place where stories were shared and arguments sometimes erupted, yet even those arguments now felt precious because they belonged to a time when everything felt permanent, safe, and unshakable, and in losing the house she lost the physical anchor of all those moments, leaving them to float in her mind like fragile glass bubbles that could shatter at any moment, and she thought about her bedroom, the one place that had been entirely hers, the space that reflected her growth in the posters she once taped to the wall, the colors she painted on the shelves, the books stacked by her bed, and it wasn't just a room, it was a world, her own private universe where she felt free to dray. Thought left a hollow ache in her chest, reminding her that some losses are not loud or violent, they are quiet, they creep in slowly until you realize something irreplaceable has slipped away, and she remembered the backyard, the place where she played for hours without worrying about the world beyond, the place where she celebrated birthdays with balloons tied to the fence, where she learned to ride a bicycle while her father cheered her on, where she once fell and scraped her knees only to be lifted by her mother's arms, and every single inch of that yard carried stories of growing up, stories that made her who she was, yet none of those stories mattered now, not to the people who would walk through that yard in the future, planting their own gardens, painting over the wooden fence, erasing all traces of her presence as though she never existed, and it was unbearable to imagine her laughter, her tears, her growth being wiped away like chalk on a board, replaced with someone else's memories, someone else's voice echoing through the same halls, and the thought brought a bitterness that she could not shake, because memories are not transferable, they do not belong in the hands of strangers, yet that was what had happened, her parents had turned her sacred history into a transaction, placing a price tag on her childhood and selling it to people who would never understand the weight of what they had taken, and she felt as though she had been robbed of a sanctuary that she thought would always be there, a place she could return to when life grew too heavy, a reminder of who she was and where she came from, and without it she felt like a tree cut from its roots, drifting without foundation, searching for stability in a world that suddenly felt colder, emptier, and she found herself clinging desperately to the images in her mind, revisiting the smell of freshly baked bread from the kitchen, the sound of her father fixing something in the garage, the playful barky house that carried her memories, and now they stood before her with open hands as though nothing had happened, as though the betrayal she carried in her heart had vanished with time, and she could not comprehend how easily they shifted roles, from the givers who once shaped her childhood to the takers who now leaned on her as though she owed them her success, and every word they spoke replayed in her mind like an echo she could not silence, words laced with need but void of remorse, and she found herself trapped in a storm of emotions, torn between anger and obligation, between resentment and love, because no matter how much they had hurt her, they were still her parents, still the figures who once tucked her into bed and kissed her forehead goodnight. And that contradiction made the request even more unbearable, because part of her still longed for their approval, part of her still yearned to feel like she mattered to them, yet their actions had made her question everything, and now she was expected to carry the weight of their choices on her shoulders, to sacrifice yet again without acknowledgement of the sacrifices she had already endured, and she thought about how unfair it was that the same people who had dismissed her feelings when they sold her home could now so casually rely on her, as if her pain was invisible, as if it had never existed, and she wondered if they even remembered the look in her eyes the day she learned about the sale, the silent tears she shed while standing in the empty rooms, the quiet devastation she carried without their comfort, and now they had returned with a sense of entitlement, as though her life was an extension of theirs, as though her achievements belonged to them, and the bitterness rose in her throat like poison, making her want to scream, to remind them of what they had done, to force them to see the scars they had left behind, but instead she remained quiet, because silence was the armor she had learned to wear. Silence was world, and the weight of that choice pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe, and she thought about how different things could have been if her parents had simply seen her, if they had simply valued her feelings, if they had chosen to protect the home that meant so much to her, and she wondered if they had ever truly understood the depth of what they had taken, or if they had only ever seen the house as money in their pockets, a transaction to move forward, never realizing that for her it was not about the walls or the land, but about the life it represented, and now they came to her as though debts could be repaid in cash, as though love could be restored through money, and she knew deep down that nothing they asked for could undo the past, nothing they received from her would change the hollow space inside her where her home used to be, and yet here she was, staring at them, trying to piece together the fragments of love and hurt into something that resembled an answer. Something that resembled a daughter's response to parents who had wounded her and yet still held a claim on her heart. She found herself trapped in a battle no one could see, a war waged not with weapons but with emotions, because when her parents asked her for money after selling the house that meant everything to her, she was left torn between two forces that pulled her in opposite directions. One side was the duty of a daughter, the ingrained voice that whispered she should honor her parents, care for them, stand by them no matter what, and the other side was the voice of her own heart, the part of her that had been broken, betrayed, and silenced, demanding she finally choose herself over them, and every time she thought she had reached a decision, the weight of guilt or anger dragged her back, leaving her restless and sleepless, replaying conversations in her head that hadn't even happened yet, imagining what it would feel like to say yes, imagining what it would feel like to say no. Own soul, and she wrestled with those opposing beliefs in silence, afraid to voice them out loud, because even admitting her doubts felt like betrayal, even whispering her truth made her feel like she was shattering some sacred rule, and the guilt gnawed at her as much as the anger did, leaving her caught in a vicious cycle where no choice felt right, and as days turned into weeks, she found herself imagining conversations with her parents, practicing words she wanted to say but never could. Words like I can't, I won't, I need to choose myself, but every time she pictured their faces, every time she imagined the disappointment in their eyes, her resolve faltered, and she felt herself shrinking back into the little girl who always wanted to please them, the little girl who feared losing their love, because deep down that fear never truly went away, even after everything, even after the betrayal, and she hated that about herself, hated that despite all the pain she still craved their approval, still longed for their affection, and it made her wonder if perhaps this was the cruelest part of betrayal, Not the act itself, but the way it left you unable to sever ties, binding you with invisible strings of love that refused to break, even when they cut into your skin. And she thought about what it would mean to finally choose herself, to finally draw a line and say no, and the thought brought a strange mixture of fear and freedom, fear of what she might lose, freedom in what she might gain. But she wasn't ready yet, she wasn't strong enough yet, because the conflict still raged within her, the voices still shouted over one another, family or self, love or dignity, forgiveness or boundaries, and she carried that storm inside her every single day, walking through the world with a smile that masked the chaos within, pretending to be fine while every decision weighed like a mountain on her chest, and sometimes she wished someone would tell her what to do, wished someone would. Like carrying scars without letting them define you, sometimes it looks like standing back up when your knees still tremble, and that was what she did, one small step at a time, carrying her pain but refusing to let it paralyze her, carrying her anger but learning to shape it into fuel. And she discovered that betrayal had given her a strange kind of clarity. It had taught her who she could rely on and who she could not. It had forced her to draw boundaries where she once had none, and though it hurt to put those walls up, it also gave her a sense of control she had never known before, a sense that her life, her choices, her future no longer belonged to the people who had wounded her. And as she embraced this newfound strength, she began to see her parents differently too, not only as betrayers but as flawed human beings, people capable of mistakes, people who could not dictate her worth, and that realization freed her, because she no longer needed their approval to define herself. No longer needed their recognition to validate her pain. She could carry her story on her own shoulders and still walk tall, and while the memories of her childhood home still haunted her, while the ache of losing it never fully disappeared, she learned to see it as part of her story, not the end of it, and in doing so, she reclaimed power over her own narrative, and she found that strength often comes disguised as loneliness, because in solitude she discovered her resilience, in silence she discovered her voice, and in betrayal she discovered the sharp edge of her own will. And though she had once feared that the loss would destroy her, she now understood that it had carved her into someone unshakable, someone who could stand in the ruins of what was once her life and still imagine something new rising from it. And the world began to look different through the eyes of this stronger self, no longer filled with illusions of safety but with possibilities of freedom, because if she could